All right, hello everyone. This video is a little bit different, but it's basically just kind of why I like Tournament Netrunner and trying to get some of you who watch my channel to go and play in more Netrunner tournaments. I'm getting, probably 400, more like 300 views on the video most of the time now, and I'm very excited about that. But also at the same time, I look and see how many people are playing in Netrunner tournaments these days, and it's a lot less than 300 players across all the different tournaments. Now, obviously, not everyone needs to play tournaments. Not everyone needs to enjoy playing tournaments, but I think some people haven't given them a shot yet, and I think there's a lot of fun to be found in tournaments. So this video is my hopefully brief kind of the why you should play it, how you play them, how they work, and some tips and tricks to get the most enjoyment out of them. I'm recording this during the time of COVID, so things will probably hopefully change in the next few months to years, and there'll be more in-person tournaments, and that's what this video is going to be a little more aimed at. So without further ado, Tournament Netrunner, why it's great, and how to get started. So this video is going to come to you in 3 parts, as I was saying. Why you should give tournaments a try, how the tournaments actually work, like what do you do on the day, what is the actual format, and then how do you get the most out of it. There's a lot of good resources out there. This is not an exhaustive video, but hopefully a good introductory one. So why should you give tournaments a try, right? Tournaments are stressful. You might think, I'm not a competitive person, I'm not going to win an event, why should I even bother going? So I'm going to start with explaining why I like tournaments, which is like, and this is going to sound weird, but like playing games with more stakes for whatever weird reason is more fun for me. It's just something in my brain chemistry, and I think it's something in a lot of people's brain chemistry that makes it more fun. And the nice thing about Netrunner tournaments is while there are more stakes because there's a social situation, there is like a leaderboard at the end that can help you rank and say, oh, I did better than this person, or I did better than I did last time. At the end of the day, the stakes are still really, really low. No one's winning hundreds of dollars of prizes. You're not spending a lot of money to play in a Netrunner tournament. It's usually like the price of a small meal, or some tournaments are even free. And so it ends up being these artificial stakes where it doesn't really matter what you do, but you've tricked your brain into playing with these stakes. And that just adds a layer of excitement and intensity to the game that sometimes isn't quite there. Now, not everyone likes that intensity and enjoyment, and if that's not your thing, it's totally understandable. But I would encourage you to give it a try just once. Another reason I like tournaments is it's a good way for me to see that I'm getting better at the game. So, one of the resources that I'm linking below is Always Be Running. And Always Be Running is a great resource to just track, see what tournaments are coming up, and also it's a way you can track yourself. So, I've played in tournaments since 2015, 2016. I didn't log them very consistently, but I have a result from 2016 where I placed 15th out of 17 people or something like that. And then I get to see over time as I get better and better and start doing better and better in higher placing tournaments. And it can be a fun way to track myself as my growth and understanding of the game is better. Another thing I can do is if I like building an off-meta deck, I can prove to people that say, no, it's not good. It's only, it's got an 80% win rate on JNet, but that's because you're up against casuals. Like, it doesn't really mean a thing. And I get to prove and say, no, my deck is actually good. I found something clever, and it works in the meta that we're in right now. And then the last thing, and this is something that a lot of people bring up, but it wasn't a thing for me for a very long time. Like, for me, part of the reason I showed up to Netrunner tournaments, the only reason really for a long time was like to kind of prove, because it was a way to play some games of Netrunner that had a little bit higher stakes and like were just some guaranteed an afternoon set aside to play Netrunner. But I would be remiss not to say that the social scene in Netrunner is fantastic. People are very friendly. They are very welcoming. And we all share a hobby, right? Everyone who goes to a Netrunner tournament plays probably a lot of Netrunner. And so you'll have something to talk about with everyone there. And then there's usually a lot of overlapping social circles. I was an awkward or am an awkward and quiet person, so I'm not always good at reaching out and starting conversation. So it took me a long time to sort of find a place in the Netrunner social scene. But it's there for you if you want it. But I also asked this question of other people. So the two big communities that I follow in Netrunner are Discord, the Green Level Clearance Discord in particular, and the Netrunner Slack called Stim Slack. And so I got a bunch of responses that hit a bunch of different things. And some of the things that I didn't mention that I want to particularly highlight is for people that like want to really prepare, you get to kind of do some directed testing and saying, here's what I think the meta is going to be. Let's try and tune the last 2 to 3, maybe 5 cards in my list just to make sure it's really good. And, you know, someone else talked about how it's a regulated space. So you can feel like there's the judge is there in part to help facilitate you having a good time, not just that everyone follows the rules. And so that's going to be, you know, there's going to be someone there who's helping to make sure everyone understands the game and everyone's behaving in the way that's appropriate for the space. And then other people saying, you know, it's hard for me to make time for Netrunner. So having a tournament means I just set aside a bunch of time and I get to play Netrunner for a whole afternoon or a whole day, and it's fantastic. So, you know, this is slide, and I apologize, these slides are quite wordy, but yeah, you know, guaranteed games, extra stakes to make the games more exciting and more memorable, and you know, having this goal to be like, no, I want to do the very best I can on today. Like, I might be better in the future, I might be worse in the future, but today my goal is just to be the best I can possibly be. It can be a really fun way to vary up your Netrunner experience. A lot of people show up to Netrunner events. You get to learn about new decks and new things that you would never see before. And some people feel like they can't bring their most try-hard decks that they really enjoy playing to a casual night. And I've definitely been in Netrunner communities where, like, yeah, the casual nights, like, if you brought a try-hard deck, you were expected to also bring a kind of fun, goofy deck so that people could choose to play the goofy deck. And sometimes people just want to play the good decks. And tournaments are a great way to play the good decks. As I said before, Nisei Code of Conduct is enforced at, I think, effectively every Netrunner tournament. And that's been a great resource. And yeah, sort of stuff I've talked about before. So, you know, hopefully, you know, I can't force, if I could, I would probably run around and twist everyone's arm and say, you have to play at least one tournament of Netrunner. It can be very, very small. You know, there's a lot of tournaments that are 8, 10, 12 people. And those are a lot of fun. And, you know, I've been talking about how tournaments in Netrunner are kind of inherently stakeless while still having the feeling of being high stakes. And those tournaments feel like the epitome of that to me. Often the way I've seen it is whoever, you know, a thing that I've seen happen at basically every Netrunner tournament I've gone to is the winner of a tournament often has won some other tournaments and might have like won the playmat that used to be handed out or have full copies of the altar that's the first place prize. And so they'll go and find someone who's new who doesn't have any of these prizes and make sure they get some of these prizes. So like the first Netrunner playmat I got was not a Netrunner playmat that I won, but a Netrunner playmat that someone gave me because I played every round and came in last place. And you know, there's this, I think Netrunner tournaments can sound very intimidating, but are, I think, ultimately really great places to learn more about the game, get more into the game, and have a good time. So, you know, I would encourage everyone to actually try and play at least one Netrunner tournament sometime in the game. And then if it's not for you, it's not for you. No harm, no foul, and you can complain to me later, and maybe I'll even pay off your costs, but can't promise that for real. So let's say I've persuaded you to say that tournaments are worth your time, but your next question is, well, how do tournaments actually work? So Netrunner tournaments, there's always some flux. These things might change a little bit over time, but basically most tournaments you go to will have a couple of things that are the same or fixed about them. So every tournament has a format, and that will usually be something like startup or standard or eternal, and that defines what deck you're allowed to bring. So Nisei has a bunch of formats they run. Some people run formats with tournaments with other formats, and they basically say, here's what the legal card pool is, and then you have to bring a runner deck and a corp deck. So you always build 2 decks for a Netrunner tournament, and you will play both decks the same number of times. I have an asterisk here. We will get to that much later in the video. And then, based on the number of people, there will be a fixed amount. There'll be a fixed number of rounds. So usually, most tournaments with like less than 16 people, 18 people, I forget the exact number, are like 3 rounds. Then it's 4 rounds for like less than 25, something like that. Then it's like 5 rounds for less than 40 and stuff like. So it slowly ticks up. And the idea is that in every round, you're going to sit down and play your opponent and then play both sides of the matchup. So you will play your corp deck against their runner deck and your runner deck against their corp deck. And then each game is won individually and reported separately. So the only thing that matters is, did you win the game or did you lose the game? The relative score, like, oh, I scored 7 and they scored 5 in one game and whatever, doesn't matter. And then after you've reported your, both of those 2 games, that will be the round. You'll play a bunch of those rounds, and then after all of the rounds are concluded, either someone will be declared the victor, or the top subset of players between 4 and 16, depending on the size of the event, will play in a double elimination bracket. So that's sort of the most basic idea of the tournament. And, the fact that I didn't write, you play both games in a round is probably something I should fix. But that's sort of the big thing, is you play your corp deck, you play your runner deck. So I want to actually talk about, before I go even more into the details of the tournament, judges. Judges are really important parts of tournaments, even though not everyone interacts with them all the time. Judges are there to facilitate the event. They're not just there to arbiter rules disputes. And so here I just have a bunch of hypotheticals about all reasons you should call a judge. I think myself and Netrunner players are sometimes a bit hesitant to call judges. I think it's something people should be making more of a resource out of. And especially if you're new, make sure to say hi to the judge at some point. Say, hey, I'm new. I might have some rules questions for you. They will say, that's great. I'm so glad you're here. And so there's all sorts of things you can ask the judge about. Is there something making you uncomfortable? Could be the temperature of the room, could be a noise, could be another player or another person in the space. Call a judge. Do you need to know where the bathrooms are? Call a judge. Do you have a question about the tournament, like its structure, its rules, or if your deck is legal? Talk to a judge. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's like, oh yeah, typical judge stuff. Like, oh, do I know a ruling? If your opponent says the ruling on a card worked a certain way, definitely call a judge if you've never seen that ruling before. Doesn't matter the player's right. It's not going to hurt the judge to explain the ruling to you and help you grow your understanding of Netrunner. And sometimes people have a ruling that's just wrong. There's been a lot of changes in rules over the course of the game, so it's always worth checking in. Did you make an illegal play by mistake? Or did your opponent, you think, make an illegal play by mistake? Call a judge to help you resolve it. It's always worth calling a judge. You can be very lenient. You can always offer stuff to your opponent, but it's often very good to call a judge when you think there's been a mistake that might have hurt the board state. You think someone might be cheating? Call a judge. And the last one I'm going to emphasize because it's a tricky one, and it's one that, people often hesitate to call a judge for, but I think is often worth it, which is, are you worried about not finishing your game because your opponent is playing really slowly? It might be worth calling a judge. Now, I know as a new player, you might be like, oh God, does that mean they're going to call a judge on me because I'm playing too slowly? In reality, this basically never happens, and the difference between someone who's intentionally playing slowly and someone who is just trying to figure out what's going on is usually pretty obvious. And it's something I would not worry about, and especially is something that people who are newer to the game or to their first tournament are definitely given a lot of leniency on. All right, so I'm going to talk about one thing that you will often hear tournaments called, or maybe not often, but sometimes called, is double-sided Swiss, which is the format that Netrunner goes under. What this really means is this is really like a portmanteau or like a subset of a thing called a Swiss tournament. So a Swiss tournament is just a way so that in every single round, everyone gets a pairing. Players are not eliminated throughout the course of the tournament. Instead, every single round you will get paired up against someone. And as the tournament goes on, you'll be paired against people in closer and closer skill brackets. So the way it works is that in the first round, you take all the players and you shuffle them up and randomly pair them off. Then in the second round, all the players who won all their games get put in a group. All the players who won one game and lost one game get put in a group. And all the players that lost both their games get put in a separate group. So you have 3 different groups of players. And then inside each group, you shuffle them up and pair off everyone in that group. And then shuffle up and pair and shuffle up and pair. And so you just keep iterating through that each round. So over the course of the tournament, you will be every round paired with someone who has the exact same or very close to the same record as you. And that means that as the games progress, you'll end up playing up against someone with a very similar skill level to you. Another thing to note is you'll never play the same person twice in a Swiss tournament, or in a double-sided Swiss tournament specifically, because you're playing both your Corp deck and your Runner deck against each player, or against the player you play against in each round. I have some kind of philosophical problems with double-sided Swiss, and we'll hit them at the sort of on the next slide where we go into some common terminology you'll hear in tournaments, but I will be making a whole follow-up video about double-sided Swiss and then single-sided Swiss, which is my proposal on how to reform the tournament structure. But before we get to that, there's the end of the round. What happens if a game goes too long, right? So something that I probably didn't mention but should have, right, is Netrunner tournaments, you have a fixed number of rounds, but the rounds can't go on indefinitely, right? They have to have some time bracket. And so every tournament, or most tournaments, give 65 minutes for the players to play their 2 games. So we get 65 minutes to play my corp versus your runner and your runner versus my corp. 65 minutes is the total for that 2 games. So if time is called during either one of those games and neither player has won, that means that the 65 minutes is up, the round needs to end, and so we need to find a way to resolve who won or lost either the active game. And so what happens is when time is called and the judge will shout time on the round, whoever turn it is when that call is made finishes their turn. So, if it was like my turn as the corp and I had spent 2 clicks and I had 1 click left, I play my last click, pass the turn, and then I get no more action. I get no more turns for the rest of the game. Then the runner would get to take their full turn. So that's time is called on the round. The active player finishes their turn, and then the other player takes 1 turn. If neither player has won after those turns finish, that partially finished turn and the other player's full turn, whoever's ahead on agenda points wins. So sometimes you can be like, oh, I would have won next turn, but I didn't. And so we just have to go by agenda points. If both players are still tied on agenda points at the end of those 2 post-time called turns, the match is reported as a tie. And that happens sometimes as well. So that's sort of that's the essentials of a tournament, right? There will be a fixed number of rounds. In every round, you will get paired up against an opponent. As the tournament goes on, that opponent will be closer and closer to you in terms of skill by virtue of having a similar record to you. You will have 65 minutes to play 2 games against that person, 1 with each of your decks. And then at the end of that time, you report back the result of each of those games. And if time has run out, you follow these overtime rules basically to determine the result of the game that went over time. Now, you might hear a couple of other terms thrown around, and so I want to cover those quickly, but often these don't matter immensely. So the first one that you'll hear a lot is strength of schedule, and this is used as a tiebreaker in tournaments. And so it's the idea of it is we want to say, oh, if two players both have the exact same score, like let's say they both won all but one of their games. Well, maybe one person had an easier set of opponents than another, and so we want to give the person who played the harder opponents kind of some tiebreaker advantage. And so that's what the strength of schedule is. It's basically it's essentially how many points all of their opponents won over the course of the tournament divided by their total number of games played. An extended strength of schedule is the exact same idea. It's the second tiebreaker, and it's saying how strong were your opponent's opponents. It almost never matters, but you will see it on Cobra, and you'll see it on some other, pairing score rating algorithms. So I figured I'd mention it. Another thing you'll hear a lot is ID. Do you want to ID is a common request you'll hear. What that means is intentionally draw. And what that means is instead of playing out any of the games with you and your opponent, you will you'll both agree to basically count as getting one win from the match. So you'll win one and lose one, just kind of guaranteed with no games played. I'm not going to go too much into why it happens, but generally the basic idea is it's because both players will make the cut with their current record, but if one player lost both games, then they wouldn't make the cut. And so for both players, it ends up being advantageous. 2-for-1s are kind of the reverse of the ID, and it's saying you and your opponent will play one game, and then whoever wins that first game counts as winning both of the games that you could have played in that round. Now, this pops up a lot in big tournaments, and I will do a full video on why 2-for-1s are a thing and maybe cover a little bit of when you should do them. But what you should know is you never have to take a 2-for-1. They are often advantageous to take. But I don't want this video to get bogged down in a lot of math when I'm trying to encourage people to play tournaments. And the honest answer is you can never take a 2-for-1 and still do very well in tournaments and still have a really good time without ever taking a 2-for-1. The thing you'll hear, and I've called it, is the cut. It's a top 4 to 16 players where you take the top 4 to 16 after all of the rounds of Swiss are done, and they play in a double elimination bracket. If you're in the US, this is like often a basketball bracket. I imagine that football, soccer matches abroad also use double elims. And the last thing you'll hear sometimes is a bye. It is a generally given out when there are an odd number of players. And what it means is that the lowest ranking player basically doesn't play that round and instead is just awarded points as if they'd won all their games. And it's mostly used to even out scores or even out if you have an odd number of people, you can't pair everyone up. And so someone needs to sit the round out, and giving the lowest ranking player a bye does the least disruption to the overall standings. Sometimes they are also given out to really well-performing players to take into a future event. All right, so I've spent a lot of time rambling on about the details of tournaments, why tournaments are fun. Let's hit some quick thoughts on how to get the most out of tournaments, how to actually make sure you have a good time. So, pre-tournament stuff. I would recommend building your decks the night before, and ideally have played them at least once. I have broken this rule a lot. Has it hurt me? Yes, I've often forgotten all sorts of things to put in my deck, including icebreakers. And that's a real bummer to show up to a tournament and go, oh, I don't have a way to break sentries. Shockingly, I actually did okay in that tournament, but, we won't worry about that too much. I also know some people that for major tournaments, they like to lock in their deck like a week in advance because it just helps them feel more at ease. Another thing I'll say, make sure you eat. I often personally struggle with this a lot, but eating, turns out it's OP to eat and have water and snacks at a tournament. So what should you actually bring to a tournament? You should bring water, you should bring your deck, you should bring your tokens, and you should bring a bag to help you easily carry everything around. Ideally, it should be something that's fairly easily identifiable. I also should have probably listed snacks there. some nice little. I'm a big fan of trail mix, but basically whatever your preferred snack of choice is. If you can convince a friend to come along, it's great because there's often downtime between rounds. 65 minutes might sound like not a lot of time to play 2 games of Netrunner, but often you're done in like 30 to 40 minutes. And so you'll have 20, 25 minutes, sometimes a little bit more in between rounds. I did once finish a round where both me and my opponent killed each other in, I believe, a total of 7 turns of Netrunner. And so we were done in 10 minutes and then had an hour between rounds. And so if you can convince a friend to come along, that's all the better. You can have someone to chat with in between rounds. The next thing, set a goal for yourself. A lot of people will set goals of like, oh, I want to place at least this high. I'm personally a bigger fan of goal setting philosophy of having it be about a process goal. Like, I want to make sure I'm never going below 2 credits at any point in my game because I think that will make me a better player. Or I want to make sure I always draw in my first 2 clicks if I'm going to draw in a turn or something, having these sort of process goals so that you can sort of hopefully they're well-designed process goals and, they'll help you improve at Netrunner even if you can't control the outcome of the game, like did I win or lose? Because that's something that's a little bit that's got external things that influence that performance. Most tournaments will have a registration time. If it's an in-person tournament, I would plan to arrive half an hour before registration. For online tournaments, I think you can be much more lax on that. And then in terms of thinking about how long it's going to take, I think you will usually be okay to assume 90 minutes between rounds, which is a 65-minute rounds, and then some extra faffing about in between rounds, and usually tournaments start a little bit late and stuff like that. And at worst case, you'll be slightly overestimating the amount of time. When you actually get to the tournament, make sure to say hi to the judge. You'll have to register, especially if it's your first tournament. Say, hey, this is my first tournament. Do you have any tips or tricks or suggestions? And then if you do feel up to it, go and try and introduce yourself to some other people. A lot of Netrunner people are very nice and friendly, but generally, and this isn't meant to be criticism, we're a bit nerdy and awkward. But we all have something in common, so talking about Netrunner can be a lot of fun. Some things, and this will come up again in my next slide, which is etiquette. Most people will grant takebacks. I would encourage you to generally be nice about takebacks, but it is, of course, up to you. And if you are new and say you're new, most people will actually be very excited. Even, when I get paired up against a new player, having now played Netrunner for almost 7 years or something like that, it's still exciting to me. And I enjoy seeing what decks they build. And I like to think I'm trying to be friendly and encourage them to come back. And then the last thing to do before the tournament itself starts is make sure you find a place where if you want to take a break and just get away from stuff or unwind a bit, figure out a place. Maybe ask a judge if there's a good place for you to sit and get some water or whatever. Doing this has helped me a lot, especially when I'm lose a game that I felt, that tilts me a little. And then my last slide here is some etiquette suggestions. So generally I would recommend against avoid eating while playing a game. This isn't always true for everyone, and there's definitely circumstances where, if you need to eat or it's the only time you feel like you can eat, people will understand, but generally it's just a thing that people dislike. But drinking water during a game, okay. Drinking anything else during a game, you do you. But do have a lid for your drink. A lot of people, you are required to have sleeves for events. That was the thing I should have put on here. But even so, avoiding spills is great. Another thing, it is totally fine to go and spectate other people's games. It's a great way to learn about Netrunner and learn about the meta. But if you are spectating, please, please, please do not audibly talk about stuff that's going on in the game. If you're there with a friend, you can whisper, and I do mean like whisper. You want to make sure only they can hear and no one else in the room can hear what you're talking about. And if someone draws a card that's like really interesting or unexpected or whatever, just do your very best not to react. everyone prefers to play just be the network between them and the person and not the crowd. In an online tournament, spectating, however, is discouraged, at least using JNet to spectate. Watching a stream in between rounds, and I will say basically every online tournament gets streamed these days, is the much preferred way to do it. Another one, and this is one that I've messed up in the past, but when you win a game against someone and you're done with the round, it can be very tempting to say, "Oh, you got unlucky," and like you almost had me and stuff like that. For some people, is something they want to hear, but for some people, they really just want to be alone in their thoughts, or they don't want to feel like they're being pitied by you. So you can let them be the first to reach out and talk about stuff if you want. Just doing something like, "Thanks for the games. It's nice meeting you. Nice playing you," is a good way to wrap it up in a way that shouldn't hurt anyone's feelings. And if they want to have a whole conversation about the games, and I often love to talk about the games after the game, talk about the deck choices, like, "Oh, why did you do this?" Then definitely feel free. And as I said before, it's entirely up to you what takebacks to allow. I've let back takebacks at all, sometimes. Generally, my rule is as long as they saw no new information or information that they couldn't reasonably have known. Like sometimes if they draw a card by mistake, mostly on JNet, because there's some automated triggers, I'll let them roll that back and stuff like that. But it's entirely up to you. I will say most communities are pretty good about it and are quite generous with it. So if that is something you're scared about in tournament play, I think I've almost never said no to a take back. I think I've only had one take back I've asked for, had the person say no, and that was, in retrospect, a pretty reasonable take back for them not to allow. So, but that is it for my slides on Tournament Netrunner. I hope this video was useful. I hope to see people trying out tournaments. And I think if I'm going to talk the talk and say you should do tournaments, I should also say that I will be hosting a startup tournament on February 20th, 2022. Starting time will be 17 UTC. That is noon Eastern time for those of you on the East Coast where I am based. And, if this video inspired you, check it out. I'll probably be trying to host startup tournaments on a monthly basis, and when I stop being able to, I will see if I can pass that mantle off to someone else. And I will also have another video soon about double-sided Swiss, why I don't like it, and why I think single-sided Swiss solves a lot of those problems. So stay tuned, and I hope to see more of you at tournaments soon.